Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. And I was going to spend most of my time thanking Yoram, former, or I guess still in some ways a classmate of mine during our time at Rutgers University. But unfortunately, on arriving to this gathering, I was triggered, and I've remained triggered the entire time because of this massive title that has stood above every speaker and that I've been forced to look at, like the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. No one has yet commented on this giant title and these words that we've been forced to look at the last few days, National Conservatism. But the first thing that struck me immediately and deeply triggered me was its color scheme. Now, Yoram could have indicated his deep allegiance to Rutgers by making it scarlet, but he did not. It's clear that as a Princeton man, as a co-founder of the Princeton Tory, and if you've spent some time talking with people in this room, you've discovered that many Princetonians of various stripes and generations have been quite artfully planted all around the room. So it's clear to me this black and orange color scheme, which is really clear on the lanyards, is yet another scheme by the Princeton cabal to take over the country. Don't let it happen. For those in the know, Princeton's unofficial motto is "In the Nation's Service," which was introduced in 1896 by its president, Woodrow Wilson. Its unofficial motto was subsequently augmented by a later Princeton president just around the time I arrived at Princeton, daily triggered by the orange color as a newly minted college professor. And that motto in 1996 reads, Princeton in the nation's service and in the service of all nations. And I learned only recently when I was investigating this that it was altered even more recently in 2016, so only 20 years after its much more woke version in the service of all nations. Its current president, Christopher Eisgruber, changed it to the following: in the nation's service and in the service of humanity. I think it will take only 5 years, maybe less, for Princeton to change that title, because it's not sufficiently inclusive simply to indicate humanity, to Princeton in the nation's service and in the service of all intergalactic life forms. Now, we should pause to reflect on the nature of this evolution of Princeton's motto. And in fact, that word was used by the current president to describe the change. Notice evolution only seems to occur in one direction in certain of our institutions. And we should pause to consider this especially not only in light of the color scheme of the title of our conference, but the combination of the words and the relative prominence, it seems to me, of one word to the other. National has been boldly highlighted. It's the larger word, really thick, and combined with a fairly thinner, far less colorful word, conservatism. The assumption conveyed by the title and in the main by the conference is that nationalism and conservatism are natural combinations. A pair as obvious as Stan and Hardy and Fred and Ginger, Batman and Robin, and Beavis and Butthead. But the origin and evolution of Princeton's motto, or unofficial motto, I think is instructive. Nationalism as an ism in American history, and especially as pronounced during the Progressive period, during the reign of Woodrow Wilson, the prominence of Theodore Roosevelt. This earlier rise of nationalism in America was not the project of conservatives, but promoted especially by self-described progressives. And I think what we have to stress is that the emphasis of this project was the explicit and desired, and indeed in many ways successful, aim to weaken more local, regional, neighborhood, and particular forms of identity within the nation. That identification that had been the hallmark of much of the American political, cultural experience. Theodore Roosevelt, whose name was invoked yesterday as at least one of the guiding lights of this new national conservatism, and I think we should be wary of that, stated in his important 1910 speech, The New Nationalism, that, and I quote, "The new nationalism puts the national need before the sectional or personal advantage," and went on to then argue that local government should cede its activities to national government. This refrain is found throughout the writings of the progressives of this period, the need to move the loyalties and identities of Americans from their local places and their people whom they live closely with to a more abstract devotion to the nation and its ideals. And this was coincident, touching on an earlier talk, this was coincident during a time in which America began to acquire an overseas empire and thought increasingly of itself as the embodiment of a universal idea that was unbounded in theory and increasingly, in fact, applicable everywhere. Indeed, in a recent book that I recommend to you entitled How to Hide an Empire by the historian Daniel Immerwahr, he notes that it was exactly during this time period, the late 19th, early 20th century, when the word America began to be used to describe ourselves, that we lived in America, that we were Americans. That before this period of time, we had described ourselves as denizens or citizens of the United States. But you needed a new word as we began to acquire overseas territories, since we weren't merely the United States anymore. And that word or term, the United States, was as often in some ways followed by the plural and grammatically correct are, as opposed to the grammatically incorrect is. Progressive authors were especially suspect of more immediate and, in their view, limiting and parochial identities of peoples who were members of towns and communities, states, and regions. In this regard, they were at least, to this extent, inheritors of the views of one of our founding fathers, especially Alexander Hamilton, again, whose name was invoked yesterday, and who was explicit in the aforementioned Federalist Papers about his hopes that people would ultimately transfer any allegiance they had for their localities, for the nation. And in particular, would identify far more with the political entity, that it would make much more possible the enjoyment of their natural individual liberties. Progressives such as Herbert Croly, the founder of the journal The New Republic, in his 1909 book, The Promise of American Life, was explicit in his praise of Hamilton's vision of a more homogeneous America and pointed to what he expected to become a more enlightened consciousness itself, an actual evolution of human nature toward a perfected humanity that would be brought about by the creation of this new nationalism. It was around this time, 1892, that Francis Bellamy, a Christian socialist, published the Pledge of Allegiance with the hope and aim of aligning people's loyalties and commitments to the nation and away from the parochial identities that had previously defined their identity as citizens of the United States. And I would show you the Bellamy salute that was originally used to salute the flag, but the journalists back there would take my picture and say Deneen was giving the Nazi salute. Thus, we see how nationalism, by a certain understanding and definition, came to undermine itself. How the evolution of Princeton's motto is entirely predictable and, I hope, worrisome, and not just because it's orange. If the aim of liberal philosophy, and especially progressive liberal philosophy today, is to transcend our local parochialisms, our particular identities, the places and people to whom we have particular commitments, those cultures and traditions located in histories and in places, then ultimately the nation will become understood as itself too confining and too limiting and too parochial. We will need to amend the progressive motto in the nation's service to in the service of all nations, and then to the service of humanity, and then to the globe and the cosmos and the entire created order. It is especially in the light of recent efforts of today's progressives, the inheritors of the nationalism of Wilson, Roosevelt, and Croly, to transcend the nation, to aspire to membership in the cosmopolis, that it seems natural for conservatives to rally around the ideal of a national community. But we should always be wary of simply occupying the ground recently vacated by progressives as the natural place for conservatives to rest. I would propose that if there's going to be a future iteration of this conference, we make at least the second word of this title at least as bold and as colorful as the first word. In part so that at least we can more visibly discern what is the object and aim of this political project. What is it that we wish to conserve? Many speakers over these last days, and especially J.D. And Mary Eberstadt, have spoken eloquently about the need to shore up the family, the absolutely disintegrating family in America, to assist the working person, the people with less advantages than those of us who live and often work in places like the nation's capital, of shoring up or at least not attacking the churches and the synagogues, of assisting the capacity of people to live in stable and decent neighborhoods. And conservatism should be about nothing less. How do we conserve the elements of what we all understand to be a flourishing life, and what we know since time immemorial, that a flourishing life depends upon a deep and stable network of people of mutual care and commitment and sacrifice. The nation, as conceived certainly by progressives, has at times, and too often in American history, been embraced from a stance of hostility to the local and the communal and the particular, and yes, even the family. But the irony is that the destruction that has been wrought by an earlier nationalism today needs to be corrected by an embrace of a new kind of understanding of the nation that assists the parts, the nation that supports people where they are, in their neighborhoods and communities and families. Any national conservatism worthy of the name needs to be clear and forthright. The nation should be embraced to the extent that it is embraced as the appropriate and necessary political unit only in insofar as it can be supportive of those aspects of our lives that require conserving. Today's progressives are now hostile to the nation, not because they cease to care about transcending any of those commitments to local and communal forms, but because they now see the nation as itself as a form of parochialism. And the libertarians who've been so vocally opposed to this gathering are fearful of the nation because they believe only that a laissez-faire philosophy and practice will ensure the blessings of individual liberty. But it has been in the pincher of these two most powerful political movements of our recent history that family and community and neighborhood and the rich associational life that so defined America that Tocqueville remarked upon it as an extraordinary feature of American life, that we've seen this especially devastated in our communities today of those living at the margins of our society. The working class, whether it's white, African American, Hispanic, and otherwise. The broken families, the absence of social capital, the decimation of community. We know that the best indicator of a flourishing life as a healthy and intact family is coming from such a family. And we can perhaps even agree with Hillary Clinton that it takes a village, if we mean a village, a community, an actual village to support families in raising children. But in America today, the ability to raise flourishing children is now a luxury good, maybe the ultimate luxury good. Today's progressives decry the deplorables even as they monopolize not just the capital, but more importantly, the social capital. And libertarians promote a globalized economic order without attending sufficiently to its effects upon the life prospects, especially of those who struggle among the working class. A national conservatism in part asks the question then, what can the nation do to support the objects and aims that conservatives care about? And we can and should begin with Tucker Carlson's proposal yesterday. If you want to raise your children, what are the policies and programs that will make it possible for you to do so? What kind of economic policies along the lines that we heard last night from Orrin Cass can support the widespread opportunity for good work throughout our nation so that those seeking decent jobs to raise their families don't all have to move to Washington, D.C.? What kinds of emphases in support of our education system will make it more likely that our most talented young people don't all have to become deracinated, placeless, commitmentless cogs and widgets on their path to the dreams of becoming a consultant? What kinds of policies will help our communities flourish? Not just building roads so they can leave with their rented U-Haul, but strong towns and cities where people want to live and stay because they can more easily practice the virtues of neighborliness, of sacrifice to a more visible common good, and yes, liberality. Here's the irony then. A national conservatism targeted toward the aim of conserving families and neighborhoods and communities and regions will actually, in interesting ways, make our identification with the nation less exclusive, and certainly will make our reliance upon Washington, D.C. less all-encompassing. Because of the forces first unleashed by this liberal project, vested in the nation, we can't simply rely upon laissez-faire as the secret recipe for strengthening our families and communities. I mean, do we really think today that leaving the field more open to Google and Facebook and Amazon and Pornhub is going to lead to the revival of the homely virtues portrayed in a Norman Rockwell painting? I live in the state of Indiana, and I can tell you, our government tried to protect our religious liberty, and it was the corporations that came in and threatened our economic destruction. And that should be fought. The nation, then, should be understood, in my view, to using a phrase of the British pluralist John Neville Figgis, as the community of communities, not composed and made up merely of individuals who constitute the state through individuals agreeing through a social contract about the protection of individual rights, but composed itself by the manifold and various communities, starting and grounded in the family, in and through which our individuality is cultivated and fostered and constituted, not a priori, but as a result of those forms of formation. The nation should above all be devoted to efforts to sustain and foster and support the communities that comprise it, and to combat where necessary the modern forces that have proven so destructive of the health of those constitutive communities. Of course, the nation can't on its own sustain these communities. If anything, these communities will sustain the nation. It's no surprise that those most hostile today to the nation are also most hostile to family, to religion, and to community in a substantive sense. National conservatism, giving pride of place to those things we seek to conserve, will also have to recognize the limits of the nation, both its abilities and its capacity to effect these ends. More than any political policy, there is a need for a change of ethos, one which honors the virtues of honor itself, of sacrifice, of gratitude, to replace those current obsessions with individual assertion, selfishness, and pride. Parenting especially is difficult. And while it is rewarding, and I speak now from experience being at the other side of this, those rewards are more likely to be recognized and enjoyed more at the conclusion of one's years, those hard years of child rearing, than when you're in the midst of the deluge. Our elites today praise the accomplishments of various leaders, professionals, athletes, especially those who kneel, but can barely spare a word to praise the daily and often unseen struggles, the challenges, the small but vital achievements of parents. The nation can't do that, but its leaders can set a tone, use its pulpit, propose a change of what it is that we honor and esteem and praise. And the nation itself is ultimately not sufficient nor properly conceived if it is not, as those words indicated, later added to the Pledge of Allegiance, so badly first conceived by that Christian socialist, Francis Bellamy, without the words, under God. Those words included at the prompting of that famous hate group, the Knights of Columbus. To be under God is to put each nation under judgment, a law beyond any nation, a comprehensive order in which the nation is ultimately only a part. The rise of progressive nationalism was also marked by the rise of a belief that the nation could be the vehicle for the creation of the kingdom of God on earth, a new and ersatz religion, and launched us today into the strange time in which those who most vehemently declare their hostility to religion are themselves the most dogmatic, the most judgmental, and the most fanatic among us. The nation under God is capable of humility about itself, about its purposes and its abilities. This capacity for humility, for self-criticism, and consciousness of the insufficiency of all merely human institutions is, to my mind, must be a fundamental hallmark of a national conservatism worthy of the name. I hope and I pray that this gathering bears good fruit, and a renewal of the things that we seek most to conserve will in turn spur a revival of this nation, of these United States.